God, thank you so much for this opportunity to be together as a church, even as we're apart. And Lord, I especially thank you for the increasing distribution of the vaccine and the hopefully falling numbers of cases that will enable us to meet in person at Cluny again soon. So Lord, we just pray for your wisdom and guidance, and Lord, as we start looking that direction, that we would be wise and safe, and we would care for our community well. And I thank you for the ways that you have sustained us as people and as a church through the last year. And Lord, I also, it's just on my mind, thank you for Lika and her ministry here at Sanctuary, and pray that you would just bless her as she moves into just a different phase now, um, and help her to know just how loved she is, not only by you, but by us at Sanctuary. And that even though she won't be on staff anymore, she is always welcome. And we love her so much. So Lord, as we turn our attention to your word, I pray that you would give us open hearts and clear minds, that we might discern what your Spirit is saying to each one of us, and that we might respond to you in a way that honors you and shows love to you and to our neighbors. In Jesus' name, amen. So we have just a great text today. We're still in Mark chapter 6. We've been going through the Gospel of Mark for most of 2021. And this is a passage that, at least on one of the commentary comment sites that I looked at, the person said something like, hats off to any preacher who dares tackle this passage, because there's no Jesus in it and there's no gospel in it. So good luck. So that was my introduction to this. When I started studying this passage today, that was the first thing I read, and I'm like, not today, this week. I was like, oh, fantastic! This will be fun. So we're just going to jump in and read the text, and then we're going to unpack it. So it's Mark chapter 6, verses 14 to 29. It's a longer one. The NIV in its little chapter titles calls it John the Baptist Beheaded. So if you like violent stories, or a Game of Thrones fan, this is going to be the text for you, because it's got everything. It's got sexual scandal, it's got death, it's got violence, it's got drunkenness. It's quite the story. So let's just jump right in. And this is the first verse references what came before. Mark, the way he sets up his narratives is he's always jumping from one thing to the next, and so he always ties them together with some sort of statement. So what came before this is that Jesus was sending out the 12 to go and preach the gospel in the surrounding cities. And so we talked about that last week. So this text picks up right after that. It says, King Herod heard about this, for Jesus' name had become well known. And some were saying, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him. This is the first time that Mark has mentioned that John the Baptist had died. So spoiler alert on that. He just throws that out there. Others said he's Elijah, talking about Jesus. Still others claimed he's a prophet, like one of the prophets of long ago. But when Herod heard this, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. And he did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And so Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she was not able to, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. Finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. And when the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you. And he promised her with an oath, whatever you ask, I will give you, up to half my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, well, what should I ask for? "The head of John the Baptist," she answered. At once the girl hurried into the king with the request, "I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he did not want to refuse her. So he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. On hearing of this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in the tomb. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Quite the story, right? So a couple clarifying comments before we get into the nitty gritty. Just some context. We know from this and other stories and a few sources outside of the Bible, some early Jewish historians and stuff, that Herod Antipas, as distinguished from Herod the Great. So when Jesus was born, there was a Herod mentioned. That was Herod the Great. In this story, he's just this new Herod is referred to just as Herod, but he's a different Herod. He's the son of the previous Herod. And so elsewhere, he's referred to as Herod Antipas. And he officially ruled Galilee and Perea as a client state of the Roman Empire. What that meant is that he didn't actually have a lot of power and authority, and he was set up as a puppet king. And so he was a Jewish person. And so Rome thought, if we institute this Jewish king over Israel, hopefully that will keep them from rebelling against us. And so Herod was someone who was really on Rome's side, but was Jewish. And so he wasn't very well respected, and most people didn't like him. And he had little more power than just as a puppet of the Roman Empire. In addition to being responsible for John's death, he also played a role in Jesus's trial when Pilate, as the Gospel of Luke records, Pilate tried to hand off responsibility for trying Jesus and eventually executing Jesus. So at first, he sent Jesus to Herod, who also happened to be in Jerusalem at the time. And Herod, being even more spineless than Pilate, just sent Jesus right on back to Pilate. And so there's this little shuffling of Jesus around in the story of Jesus's trial at the end of the Gospels. And Luke records that story. We learn from this text that Herod wasn't totally against John. It says that he liked to listen to him. He was perplexed by him, but he found John's preaching interesting. And it's easy to see parallels today when we find preachers or people giving speeches, find TED Talks where we go, I don't agree with everything this person says, but I'm interested in looking in listening to them. And so that was Herod's relationship with John. But then John got into trouble by critiquing Herod's problematic marriage to Herodias. And Herodias had been married previously to Herod's half-brother Philip. And the story goes like this. We find this from outside the text of Scripture. But that one time while visiting Philip in Rome, Herod and Philip's wife Herodias hit it off, and then developed an agreement with them and presumably with Philip as well. And an arrangement was made so that Herodias divorced Philip and came to live with Herod, and they got married. And Herod divorced his previous wife and got rid of her. And then to add to the whole Jerry Springerness of this entire escapade, Herodias also happened to be Herod's niece. So we have all sorts of intrigue. We've got a little bit of incest thrown in. This is a messed up story. And John very rightly was critiquing this in a very public setting. So he would just very publicly call out Herod, who was the ruler over the area where John was doing his ministry in the region of Galilee. And Herod got tired of this and finally arrested John. And clearly from the story here, Herodias had some part in that she may have been even angrier than Herod about the things that John was saying, and so she was nudging her husband on a regular basis. And this all comes to a head at Herod's birthday party, which is described in our text today. And Herodias's daughter, who is also probably Herod's daughter, and is a young girl, comes in and dances for Herod and for the party guests. Now, many people have assumed that there's a sexual arousal component in the story and with the dance, and it's not hard to see where people get that. But it's actually much more likely that this girl was young, maybe 10, 11 years old, and it's likely that Herod's pleasure with the dance and subsequent promises probably had a lot more to do with him being drunk and being a proud father and showing off to his guests than with a direct, like a lecherously lusting after his own daughter. Although Herod is a bad enough guy that is still within the realm of possibility. But probably the more likely thing that happened here is his young daughter comes in and does a cute dance, and he just thinks she's the best, and he's drunk off his rocker because it's his birthday party and they've been partying for a long time. And so he just starts boasting, I'll give you anything, even up to half my kingdom. Isn't my daughter the best person in the world? And showing her off to the guests. And then she being wise and surely having been coached by her mother ahead of time so that hopefully this exact thing would happen, she is coached to go demand the head of John the Baptist, which is then given to her. So a couple things make this passage particularly interesting and notable within the Gospel of Mark. The first of those things is that it's told as an inserted flashback, and we don't have a lot of those in the Gospel of Mark. And it's seemingly inserted without reason into the story. If you look at the text right before and after, you go, how does this fit into the chronology? Because it appears that this beheading of John the Baptist had happened at least sometime before the current events of where we're reading in Mark. And so it's told as this flashback. And if you rush through it, it's easy to go, what reason is there for this being here? But I would caution that biblical writers tend to have very good reasons for everything that they do. And so we're going to be talking about the probable reasons why this text is inserted where it is. Also, aside from a couple of verses in chapter 14 and the resurrection story in chapter 16, which we talked about on Easter, this is the only other story in Mark in which Jesus never appears. John is writing the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so every story in this gospel is about Jesus. And in nearly every story in this gospel, Jesus appears and acts within the story. But in this particular story, Jesus is mentioned at the beginning, but he never takes the stage at any point in the story. Adding to that, this is the longest of all of the stories that Mark tells in his gospel. Mark is famous for his brevity. And though there are a lot of overlapping stories between Mark and Luke and Matthew, they share a lot of the same stories, even sometimes the same wording. If you look at all three in parallel, Mark's version of almost every story is shorter than the other guys' versions of it. But in this case, Mark is much longer than the other Gospels. And in fact, this is the longest story that Mark tells. So of all the other stories he tells, he doesn't spend nearly as much time as he does on this story that doesn't feature Jesus, and goes on and on about Herod and John. So partly because of these interesting tidbits, and also because it's a biblical story and we should pay attention to them all, we can't brush this off or skip over it, as troubling a passage as it is and as confusing a passage it is. Mark thought it was important, so it should be important for us to figure out what is going on here. What is Mark trying to communicate by telling us this story? The story itself is easy enough to understand, but the why is it here? That's really what we want to get at. So I'm going to explore three questions today. And those three questions are this: why is this story here? Why did Mark include it? Why is this story here? Um, Getting at that, what is the point of telling this story out of chronological order, inserted right where it is in chapter 6, and looking at what that has to say to us? And then, based on our answers to those questions, what does it mean for us today? So that's the outline. I'm going to try and get through this stuff quickly. There's a lot to cover. So thank you for bearing with me and being patient. And I'm sure we're going to get through it. But that's our outline for the morning. So why is this story here? Why did Mark include the story of John's beheading in such detail? And I think one of the keys to answering this question is noticing the parallels between this story and several other biblical stories. And so the first one I want to look at is the story of Elijah. And there's a lot of parallels in this story with the story of Elijah that is told in 1st and 2nd Kings. Part of how we know about why we know that this parallel is important. Sorry, there's a lot to cover and I'm jumping around in my notes. Here's what we know about Elijah. Elijah is an Old Testament prophet. His story is told in 1st and 2nd Kings. His primary conflict in his story is with the Israelite king Ahab and Ahab's non-Israelite wife Jezebel. And so there's some parallels between Ahab and Herod in this case. And Jezebel was instrumental in convincing Ahab and the people of Israel to serve and worship the false god Baal. And one of the most significant stories in Elijah's story is when Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to a sacrifice off on Mount Carmel. And it's probably my favorite of the Elijah stories. There's a number of Elijah stories in 1st and 2nd Kings. But basically, he challenged them to this duel. And he said, you set up an altar on your side and I'll set up an altar on my side. And we'll pray and we'll see whose God comes down and consumes what's on the altar. And so 450 prophets of Baal dance around the altar, praying loudly from morning to noon for Baal to consume the sacrifice. And Elijah stands a little ways off, mocking them, saying, oh, maybe you should pray louder. Maybe he's asleep. Or maybe he went on vacation. I'm not sure he heard you, so maybe you should pray louder. And as they start to get embarrassed and more nervous, the prophets of Baal start cutting themselves and shouting and just making more and more of a ruckus, trying to get their God to respond. And they pray until evening with no success. And so at this point, it's Elijah's turn. And so Elijah builds an altar with 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 is a significant number throughout the Bible. And then he has them, he puts the meat for the sacrifice on the altar, and then he has them drench the wood and the meat and the entire altar with water, with 4 giant buckets of water. And then Elijah just calmly prays and asks God to accept the sacrifice. And immediately fire falls from the sky and consumes not just the sacrifice, but the stones and the altar itself in one of these ultimate displays of power. And then as soon as this happens, and many people from the nation of Israel are standing around watching, Elijah calls on them to kill the prophets of Baal, which happens. And then Jezebel puts out a kill order on Elijah, and he flees to the wilderness, and then his story continues. And if you want to read it, it is just a fantastic story, great narrative. 1 Kings 18 and 19 cover this particular part of Elijah's story. So that's the background on Elijah. So what I think Mark does is he intentionally draws some parallels and brings Elijah to mind for his original readers and for us today. So in verse 15 of this passage, Elijah is mentioned by name, and that happens for a couple reasons. Elijah, at the end of his life, was escorted into heaven by chariots of fire, where the movie gets its name, and then prophesied at the end of Malachi that he would return in advance of the Messiah to herald Messiah's coming and to prepare people's hearts. And so uh, when Mark mentions Elijah in this context and connecting to John, he's helping us to see the connections, and then we start to see the similarities between the stories. So Herod and Ahab are both presented as weak leaders who are pressured by others to do something wicked. So in Ahab's case, he's pressured by Jezebel to both worship Baal, to lead Israel in worshiping Baal, and then to issuing the kill order on Elijah. Um, in Herod's case, he's pressured by Herodias to first arrest and then kill John the Baptist. And then there's direct parallels between John and Elijah. Both of them are prophets who spent a lot of time in the wilderness. Both of them are prophets who suffered for speaking out against powerful people. Um, uh, and in fact, Jesus himself links John with Elijah and says that John is the fulfillment of the prophecy in Malachi that Elijah would come first, that John is the one spoken of who would prepare people's hearts and minds for the coming of Messiah. And we certainly see that to be true in the relationship between John and Jesus. But the parallel with Elijah is just one of the parallels that we're invited to see here in this story. The second parallel is with Jesus himself. And so even though Jesus never takes the stage in this story, Jesus' story looms large within this story. And it's actually a foretaste in this story of what is going to happen to Jesus. So it begins by this account of Herod and his people discussing Jesus's identity. And so we see that in the early verses. And Herod thinking that John had been resurrected. And if you know Jesus's story, as most of us do, and as the original readers of the Gospel of Mark probably did, they see this worry that Herod has that John has been resurrected. And they go, wait a minute, John wasn't resurrected, but Jesus will be resurrected. We know that's coming. And so there's this foretaste. And so we're meant to go, oh yeah, there's some similarities in this story to Jesus. Then again, as with Ahab, Pilate, like Ahab, is similar to Herod. He's presented as a weak leader, pressured by others to do something evil. But this time, the people that Pilate is pressured by are the chief priests and the teachers of the law, the religious elite centered in Jerusalem and in the temple. And they're the ones who rile up the crowds and pressure Pilate to impose the death penalty on an innocent man. And then Jesus and John are very similar in that they are both prophets who are eventually killed for speaking truth to power, for calling out leaders. In Jesus's case, primarily he was calling out the religious leaders who kept expanding their power and wealth at the expense of the people they were meant to serve. And in John's case, for calling out Herod and his wife Herodias. And then there's a further parallel. This passage ends in Mark 6:29, which talks about John's disciples coming to collect the body and place it in the tomb. And that brings to mind the very similar scene that Mark is going to record at the end of Mark chapter 15, where Joseph of Arimathea goes and retrieves Jesus's body, and then along with several of the female disciples, buries it, and then the women stay to stand vigil, and then eventually show up on Easter morning and are the first to see and hear the story of the resurrected Christ. So all of this I've given you as information to help answer the question of why is this story here? And I think what these parallels do is they show us that one of Mark's primary reasons for including this lengthy story with all these details is to draw attention to the social and political realities that face all godly prophets who get political. People are always complaining when preachers get political, unless the preacher just happens to agree with the political standpoint that the person shares, at which point they never seem to mind. But I've been critiqued myself for getting too political, and every prophet who's ever gotten political, meaning that they've started speaking about the power structures and disrupting the status quo, and maybe suggesting that Christians shouldn't just go along to get along at all times. and suggests that we have social responsibility. Whenever a prophet or preacher engages in this sort of ministry, in fact, whenever a disciple of Jesus engages in this sort of ministry, they face hardship, and they are often threatened with death or with persecution. And so that's part of why Mark includes it, to show that reality that faces anyone who gets into the prophetical business of speaking truth to power. And the second reason he includes it is to emphasize that Jesus was an innocent man murdered by the state for speaking truth to power, to provide us a perspective on Jesus's death that has often been overlooked throughout human history. We've tended to focus a lot more on the salvific nature of Jesus's death, on the spiritual realities contained in Jesus dying and come back to life, and sometimes ignored the very present political and physical realities of Jesus's death, which is that Jesus was an innocent man who was murdered by the state for speaking truth to power. And this perspective on the cross was really driven home for me earlier this year when I watched a talk given by the late James Cone, who passed away in 2018, but was an African-American theologian and a professor at Union Theological Seminary. And in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which is still on my to-read list, I'll confess I haven't read it yet, but the talk that he gave overlapped a lot with the content, so I think I have some idea. But in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Cone draws parallels between Jesus's death and the thousands of Black men and women who were lynched between 1880 and 1940, usually by white people claiming to be followers of Jesus. It's a horrendous part of American history. It's a horrendous part of church history, and one that we need to recognize and deal with. So I encourage you to read that book or look up the talk that he gave on it, which is about an hour long, and worth watching. But it struck me, and this quote kind of captures Cone's main idea. It's a longer quote, but I invite you to really ponder what he says here. He says, "The cross and the lynching tree interpret each other. Both were public spectacles, shameful events, instruments of punishment reserved for the most despised people in society." And that is true of crucifixion as much as it is of lynching. And he says, any genuine theology and any genuine preaching of the Christian gospel must be measured against the test of the scandal of the cross and the lynching tree. This is why Paul refers to the cross as foolishness to the Gentiles. Jesus did not die a gentle death like Socrates with his cup of hemlock. Rather, he died like a lynched Black victim or a common Black criminal in torment on the tree of shame. The crowds shout, "Crucify him," anticipated the white mob's shout, "Lynch him." And Jesus' agonizing final cry of abandonment from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" was similar to the lynched victim Sam Hose's awful scream as he drew his last breath, "Oh my God, oh Jesus." In each case, it was a cruel, agonizing, and contemptible death. It's important that we not rush past these similarities. It's important that we recognize the very real political realities that led to Jesus's death and how they are echoed in our own experiences in this world and the things we see still to this day. Why is this story here? I believe it's to draw attention to the social and political realities that face godly prophets who speak truth to power, and to show that this is one of the core reasons why Jesus died, which also connects to the answer to the second question I said we'd talk about, which is, why is this story here? Mark could have included it anywhere in the gospel, and it would have been more chronologically correct to place it earlier in the gospel, but he put it here. Like I said, biblical authors don't do things without reason. And I think I've mentioned in earlier sermons how Mark likes to use this thing called a sandwich structure, where he connects two seemingly unconnected stories by inserting one of the stories right in the middle of the other and sandwiching it between the beginning and end of another story. And he does this to show the thematic connections between the two stories and to encourage his readers to interpret the stories through each other. And in this case, the story of the death of John the Baptist is inserted between the beginning and the end of the story about Jesus sending out his disciples to preach the gospel. And that story, which we looked at last week, begins in Mark 6 through 13, but it officially wraps up with one more verse in Mark 6, verse 30, which follows immediately after the story of John the Baptist, when the disciples return and give Jesus a report on all the things that they had done and taught. And so Mark is sandwiching this story right in the middle of the larger story of the disciples going out to preach the gospel. And this sandwich structure suggests that Mark is seeing a parallel between what happened to John and what had happened to Elijah and what would soon happen to Jesus, and what Jesus's disciples should expect to encounter if they follow Jesus and John and Elijah's pattern of speaking truth to power. And that leads us to our third and final question, which is, what does this mean for us today? And it's not hard to see the parallels between the political realities of Jesus' day and the echoes in our own situation, and the calling that was placed on Jesus' disciples in the first century, and the invitation that God gives to us today to follow Jesus and to deal with the consequences of following Jesus. This story that Mark tells of John the Baptist highlights a truth spoken by one highly paid Washington lobbyist who was quoted in the Washington Post as saying, "There are only two engines that drive Washington. One is greed and the other is fear." And I think we can all just recognize the truth of that statement. And that's exactly what's going on in Mark's story. He talks about Herod executing John the Baptist purely out of fear of what his guests are going to think, the greed that Herod had that had led to his power. Greed and fear are what drove Ahab and Jezebel. Greed and fear are what drove Herod and Herodias. Greed and fear are what drove Pilate and the chief priests and the teachers of the law. And greed and fear are the hamsters that spin the wheels that move our world today and fuel the systems of power that we see. And this story speaks the same message to us that it did to Jesus's earliest disciples 2,000 years ago. And I believe it's a message of both warning and invitation. The warning is this: those who take up the prophetic ministry of speaking truth to power will face strong resistance. Anyone who takes up the prophetic ministry, and this applies to preachers and pastors and to everyone who would call themselves a disciple of Jesus, when you take up the ministry of speaking truth to power, you're going to face strong resistance. As Paul wrote in Ephesians 6:12, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. What that means is the enemy is not any one person, but it's the systems and the greed and the fear and all of the other underlying causes that feed into the systems of power that rule humanity with injustice in every generation. And our battle as followers of Jesus is against those systems. And part of the calling on our lives, the invitation on our lives, is to speak against those systems. The enemy uses the tools of greed and fear to feed systems of injustice and wickedness. And if we seek to combat injustice and wickedness by speaking the truth in love to our friends, our family, our Facebook followers, and to the powers that be, the enemy is gonna fight back. And that's what this story is telling us. That's the warning. Follow Jesus at your own risk. But there's also an invitation. And the invitation is a powerful one, and it's this: do it anyway. The warning is, if you do this, you're going to suffer. Do it anyway. Yes, following Jesus, really following Jesus, means saying the types of things that he said and doing the types of things that he did. It means identifying with the marginalized. It means pursuing justice for the poor and freedom for the captives. It means resisting systems of power whenever and wherever they are fueled by fear and greed. It means calling out those in leadership when they do things that are unrighteous and immoral and which damage humanity and damage people. And yes, if you do those things, it's gonna hurt. You're gonna lose friends. You might get attacked verbally, even physically. Do it anyway. Because the other thing this story tells us is that those who die in the cause of justice do not die in vain. John's death wasn't in vain. It exposed Herod's weakness, and it helped to lead to Herod's downfall. Though it's not recorded in the Bible, the first century Jewish historian Josephus, one of the best extra biblical sources that we have from the first century, describes that Herod's army was defeated in battle and how some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God as a just punishment of what Herod had done against John, who was called the Baptist. For Herod had killed this good man who had commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, righteousness towards one another, and piety towards God. In other words, society, after this happened, when they saw Herod's army defeated, they went, you know why that happened? It's because he killed that righteous man, John. The righteous who die in pursuit of justice for speaking truth to power do not die in vain. And we know that Jesus' death wasn't in vain either. In addition to bringing salvation and forgiveness and triumphing over death and sin and all of the other great theological realities that we can and do talk about within the church. In addition to that, Jesus' death exposed the rot that had formed at the heart of the religious elite of his day. And even if nothing else had happened, Jesus' death showed the injustice that existed at the heart of the marriage of power between Rome and Jerusalem, between the state and religion. And his death, the death of an innocent man executed by the state, was in itself a prophetic act of judgment against the very state that executed him, just as many other righteous deaths have been prophetic acts of judgment against the states that execute them. The warning is this: if you follow Jesus, you'll experience difficulty. And the invitation that follows is follow Jesus anyway. And so the one question that I think we're left with today, and it's another would you rather question. We've had two already today, and here's the third, is when you read this story, would you rather be Herod or John? Because that's the choice we have. Herod let fear and greed and foolishness lead him to worldly power and a false kind of prestige, and eventually to ruin, but not before he benefited greatly from his foolishness and his greed and his fear. Herod's path is the easier path. Or would you rather be John? John, who let righteousness and truth lead him to prison and to death, to faithfulness and to glory. It's the harder path, but I would argue it's the better one. So which would you rather be? As you think about that, we're going to give just a few moments for silent reflection. I encourage you to think about that question, also to consider what invitation are you hearing from God today, through the sermon, through the service, and what is one thing that you can do as a response to today's service? As I often say, we're incapable of holding on to all 30 minutes of my sermon today. I can't even, I have to write notes down, so I don't expect you to remember everything I've said. Pick one thing to take with you today. One thing that you're hearing from God, one insight that you want to hold on to. Write it down, stick it on the mirror in your bathroom so you see it tomorrow morning or tonight when you brush your teeth. And maybe one thing that you can do as a response, one way you can apply this message or the songs we've sung into your life today. So we'll give you a couple minutes to think about that, to maybe write that down. And then Tony will lead us in a final song of worship and of response.